Welcome to the Tackling Bindweed and Thistle in Agriculture session. Thanks for all joining. There's a lot of interest in this session, which is nice to see everybody, but obviously it is a sign that this is a big issue for a lot of people. So I hope that this session is helpful for you all. So I'm Sarah Stewart, the Extension and Events Coordinator for Organic BC and the organizer of the event. We're happy to bring you this session courtesy of funding from the Ministry, the BC Provincial Ministry of Agriculture and Food with through the Sustainable Canada Agricultural Program. I would like to start this session by recognizing that we're hosting on all of the unceded and sovereign Indigenous territories across this province, known colonially as British Columbia, and this country known colonially as Canada. I am currently hosting as an uninvited guest on the territories of the Liwat and the Statliam nations. And I would like to acknowledge these First Peoples and the rights they should have to the lands that we're on. I think many of you are working within different territories in the province and possibly even around the country and maybe even further afar. And so I'd also like to give recognition to the land and the First Peoples of that land that we're all on.
Sorry, Sarah, you're muted. Sorry, I accidentally muted you. Can you unmute yourself?
Thank you. Hi. I'm not sure, how long was I muted for there? Okay.
Just for a minute.
Okay.
Half a minute.
Perfect. I'll start at the point where I was saying that I will be recording the session. If you don't want to be recorded and you will be part of the sort of the Q&A parts, please just mention in the chat that you don't want to be recorded, and we'll make sure that you don't get distributed when we distribute the recording to other people. I'm going to be launching a poll, which I might actually do right now. If you can just take a really quick minute and answer the questions. There's two very, very simple questions in the poll. If you just take a moment right now and answer those two questions, it just gives us a really good idea of where people are coming from. But also, if there's time at the end, we will be doing some breakout room work based on the answer to question 1. So that would be fantastic if we could fill that out. Yeah, basically the format of this session today is that we have 4 different presenters. Each presenter is going to speak for 15 minutes, and there'll be a chance for questions at the end of each presenter's presentation. And so basically, while a presenter is speaking, if you have any questions, please feel free to put your questions in the chat, and I'll bring those up with the presenter at the end of their presentation. If you are putting a question in the chat, if you can start that question with the word question, so we can field out what in the chat is a question, basically, that really helps us. And then you also have the opportunity at the end of each presenter to raise your hand as well and just ask questions on the spot at that point as well. So feel free to do that. I believe that is everything that I wanted to share with you. So we're going to get started. Our first presenter is Dr. Patrick Carr of Montana State University. I'm just going to get him as our spotlit host. There we go. Fantastic. He is sharing the screen. Okay. Okay. I'm going to spotlight you there. Take me off spotlight and away you go. Thank you, Patrick.
You bet. Hello, everyone, and good morning or afternoon, I guess, to some of you. So I appreciate very much the opportunity to come and speak with you about our Creep Stop project. That was what I was asked to discuss. It was a project that was conducted in Montana, North Dakota, and Washington. Although I'm only going to be able to talk about just a few of the experiments within that project, and they all occurred within Montana. You can see the investigators involved at the bottom of this the screen, and it was a pretty big project. Okay. I don't know what's going on with the background noise, but makes it more interesting. So anyway, the project really grew out of a survey that was done of organic farmers in Montana now several years ago, and they were asked, when growing your wheat and other grain crops, what is the top obstacle or obstacles you face in doing so successfully? And not too surprisingly, they came back and said, successful weed management is our biggest challenge. And the two species that were identified as causing the most headaches were Canada or creeping thistle and field bindweed or creeping jenny. So for purposes of this presentation, again, because of time, I'm going to focus on just a few experiments. Their focus was creeping thistle. I will say that we did have duplicate work done with field bindweed or creeping jenny, and results were very, very similar between the studies and the two species. So just remember everything that I say in regards to this as it applies to creeping thistle in our experience also apply to creeping jenny or field bindweed. So the one study that I'm going to discuss very briefly again is a study that was put in place at two locations within Montana. Those are represented by the larger stars. One was near Moccasin in the central part of the state, and the other was near Bozeman in the southeast part of the state. The study was really focused on comparing different IPM strategies, integrated pest management strategies, or integrated weed management strategies, and identifying those which were most successful in suppressing creeping thistle. So this is a picture I took of the location at the Moccasin site where I'm located. You can see patches of creeping thistle in the field where the experiment was established. That's pretty typical, as we all know. Bindweed and thistle tend to not form uniformly across a field. You tend to find in an infested field patches, and you can see those here. I think you can make out the alleys where there's very little thistle, and this was obviously before the treatments were imposed. We had 6 crop sequences, or I'm sorry, 8 crop sequences or practices that were established at both locations. I don't have time, given the limitations, to walk through all 8, but I can point out a few things. First, you'll notice common across all 8 sequences in year 4 was hard red spring wheat. That's what that HRSW indicates. We felt we could compare the impact of the previous 8 treatments best in that 4th year if we had a common crop and didn't confound comparisons with having a bunch of different crops. Second thing to notice is as you move from crop sequence or crop practice 1 to crop sequence or crop practice 8, you move from a sequence that's heavy in forages, with one having a barley nurse crop harvested for forage in year 1, with an alfalfa underseeded crop then harvested for forage in years 2 and 3. 2, at the other extreme, crop practice or sequence 8, where you had a hard red spring wheat grain crop grown in year 1, a hard red spring wheat grain crop grown in year 4, and no forages represented. Okay. Third thing to notice is as you move from crop practice or sequence 1 to crop practice or sequence 8, with 8 being obviously the most intensive, more and more tillage. And in crop practice or sequence 8, we had 2 successive years, as you can see, of fallow, where intensive tillage was used. Not a sustainable practice, but we were pretty confident that would do a pretty good job of suppressing thistle. Okay. I should also mention that in spite of our greatest efforts, we were not always successful in establishing a few of the crops, and it's not real surprising. We're a dryland site where I'm located at. Our annual precip is 13.5 inches. That's average. So we had hoped, like in crop practice 2, to be able to establish a triticale forage crop in the fall for forage the next spring. That wasn't difficult. But then we had hoped to follow that with a foxtail millet forage crop planted in late June to early July, and we were never successful. It was simply too dry. These are dryland sites. The other challenge we had was sweet clover, biennial yellow blossom sweet clover. We didn't have too much of a problem establishing it and seedlings to emerge. We weren't anticipating, and we probably should have, the very heavy infestation of sweet clover weevil. So we did a really nice job of feeding the weevil. We didn't have anything left. So we did go in afterwards, as is indicated here, and plant an emergency Austrian winter pea crop for forage. So here's the layout at the moccasin location, and it was pretty similar at the Bozeman location. And if you have time and you count, you'll actually see 16 plots versus 8 within each of the blocks. That's because in addition to the sequences, we also applied 2 tillage approaches. One was what we termed a standard or a conventional approach, the other a reduced approach. In the standard approach, when tillage was called for, we tended to rely on inversion tillage implements like a disc. So we did a lot of soil disturbance, a lot of soil inversion. When we harvested a forage, we harvested as a hay crop. In the reduced tillage approach, when tillage was called on and we did tillage sparingly, we tended to use a non-inversion implement like a wide sweep on a no-bow blade whenever we could. We also harvested forage by grazing with sheep. Okay, so what did we find? Well, you can see along the y-axis, we got creeping thistle density in tillers or stems or ramets per square meter. And then you can see the 4 years along the bottom. And then below that, I have listed again the 8 sequences or rotations, going from that rotation 1, where we have a barley nurse crop, and then followed by 2 years of alfalfa for forage, all the way to that rotation or sequence 8, where we have a hard red spring wheat crop followed by 2 successive years of fallow. And obviously in year 4, again, we had wheat across all 8 treatments. Now, if you look at year 1, really in the end, that's before we start to see the effect of treatments. Okay, so even though there's a difference, that's really not the effect of treatments. So for example, if you look at the density of rotation 8, that's indicated by the pink bar, is quite high relative to rotation or sequence 1, indicated by the orange bar. That's really just by happenstance where those plots were established. As again, we know that thistle forms patches, and it just so happened that where the plots were placed representing treatment 8, there was just more of those thistle patches than in plots where treatment 1 was placed. But beginning in year 2 and into year 3, and then we see impacts of the treatments in year 4. That's where we really start to see the treatment effects. Okay, and I don't have again time to walk through all 8, or I'm going to go way beyond my 15 minutes. But a couple things I'd like to point out. If you look at rotation or sequence 1, and that's the one where they had the barley nurse crop plus the alfalfa year 1, and then in years 2 and years 3 alfalfa. Starting in year 2, where we really start to see the treatment effect, you'll notice a stepwise reduction in creeping thistle density. Okay, so by the time we get to year 4, that creeping thistle density is approaching 0. I mean, we still had a few stems, but there weren't too many. So alfalfa, and this is both locations, we saw the same results at both locations. Alfalfa was very effective in suppressing creeping thistle, and in as I said, the companion study, which Zach Miller headed up, similar results with field bindweed. Okay. Oh, brother. Okay. Now, treatments 2 through treatments 7, which I really haven't said too much about, and I just don't have time, but they were all comprised of annual species used to as forages or as grain crops. If you compare the number of stems in year 1 versus year 3, you'll see a clear trend for stem numbers, density to be increasing over time. They weren't very effective. Okay, so all those treatments we had hoped were going to be effective were not effective. If we go to our rotation 8 or sequence 8, That's the one where we had those 2 successive years of fallow. Not too surprisingly, starting in years 2, 3, and 4, we again see relatively low levels of creeping thistle density. So the bottom line of our study demonstrated that alfalfa is very effective in suppressing creeping thistle, as is a long fallow period. And in fact, alfalfa is equally as impressive in terms of suppressing thistle. That is, you have to have a good alfalfa stand. If you had a good stand like this, which we did, and this is actually the study where those are field bindweed skeletons. If we were successful in establishing alfalfa, it did a very good job of competing with both those noxious perennial weeds. You can't have a poor alfalfa stand where you've got a lot of skips and expect that to do a good job of suppressing those weed species. Okay, it's got to look like this. Okay, what were the impacts on wheat yield that 4th year? Well, in general, somewhat similar. You'll notice in the treatment 8, in this case, it's represented by the pink bar. Wheat yields were quite high relative to other treatments. In that particular treatment, wheat following 2 successive years of fallow, not too surprisingly, relative to other treatments, and that both was true under reduced and standard tillage. We did see a little bit of jockeying for treatments 2 and 7, depending on when or on which tillage approach was used, reduced or standard, at the Central Ag Research Center site near Moccasin. What you'll also notice, however, is that the wheat yield following the alfalfa treatment was very low regardless of tillage treatment. So it wasn't the case at the Moccasin site that if we were able to suppress creeping thistle, that automatically translated into high wheat yield. But I think a hint as to why that was the case is if you look at the wheat yield numbers over there on the y-axis, those are low wheat yields, very low. Okay, so there was lower yield when wheat followed alfalfa in this study than when wheat followed virtually any other crop, but particularly the fallow. Well, at this site, our soils are extremely shallow. They do not hold water. They're only 2 feet or less in depth. But also, in the year that the wheat was grown, we had less than 8 inches of annual precipitation. That's for the entire year. It was extremely dry. So there was a tremendous drag in wheat yield following alfalfa at the dry site. At the Bozeman site, that was not the case. Here, we were unable to detect a significant drop in wheat yield following alfalfa versus following 2 years of fallow. So there was no difference, and it had to do with water. At this location, soils are deep. We had 21 inches of precip over the 2022-23 growing season. As a result, the alfalfa was able to suppress creeping thistle, and we saw no yield drag. And in fact, we saw, yield enhancement versus many of the other treatments. Okay, and as I said, similar results with field bindweed. So what we did find is that 3 years of perennial legume, in our case alfalfa, was really equally impressive in suppressing both creeping thistle and bindweed, as was a very long extended fallow period where tillage was used, which I don't think any farmer with any interest in sustainable agriculture would follow. So there is a biological solution. It's growing alfalfa or perhaps some other perennial crop for forage. The challenge is in drier sites. If you grow a perennial forage and then try to follow that the following spring with a grain crop, you likely will see a yield drag at least during dry years. Okay. I think too, we might be able to tweak some of those rotations or sequences 2 and 7, make them a little more effective, but they're not going to be as effective as alfalfa. I'm pretty confident of that. And we do thank our funders for that study. Now, very quickly, I was asked to touch on one other thing that we looked at, and I don't have time to talk about everything. There was much more than just this. But we were very interested in looking at the impact of a biological control, a potential biological control, thistle rust, on thistle suppression. And a graduate student actually got a hold of this and ran with it. And what the graduate student was interested in determining is, was there any kind of interaction with different tillage approaches and this rust on thistle suppression? Okay, that's really what they were asking. So there were two approaches, again, kind of a conventional approach. Now, in this case, it wasn't as intensive. Initially, there was inversion tillage used, but it was only used in the fall, and then they began to use inversion tillage in the spring and fall, but that was it. So there were two tillage operations, spring and fall, and reduced tillage, which really was almost no tillage. And in a reduced tillage system, what they did is they used flail mowing quite a bit, grazing, and then when they had to, they did a very light, really light cultivation, almost like a harrowing. This is what they found. You can kind of read it for yourselves. And then in some plots, they infected the thistle. They inoculated some of the thistle plants with that rust fungus. In other plots, they did not, and they did the same thing in both standard tillage plots and reduced tillage plots. And that's what the red indicates, plots where there were some inoculated thistle plants with the rust. And the blue dots and lines indicate plots where there was no inoculation. And they did this over 4 years again. And what they found was, in the standard tillage system, they actually saw a reduction in thistle, but it wasn't near as dramatic as it was in the reduced tillage system. And they attribute this to the fact that the mowing actually helped basically move that rust fungus on the creeping thistle debris across the plots and enhance the rate of infection and the reduction in creeping thistle. So we do have a ways to go before we can really get this into a form where the rust could be distributed. You know, this was all hand infected, but I think there is some promise for this. And how much promise? Well, in the case of the reduced tillage approach, they saw as much as about a 40% reduction in plots where they had infected some thistle plants and then also mowed and did other things to maybe enhance the spread of that. So I think there's some real positives about this. That's all I've got. I'll stop sharing my screen and open it up for questions or comments. Hopefully I haven't put everybody to sleep.
Not at all. Thank you so much, Patrick. That is super informative, and it's really great to see the work and the successes that have happened there. Does anyone want to unmute themselves and come forward with questions? I have Sol Kinnis here who's raised her hand.
Yeah, I'm curious, when you were doing the harvesting and clearing and grazing, are you timing that with the flowering cycle?
We were with the grazing. Yeah, we definitely were with the grazing. We were timing it, but we were timing it more on where the crop was at, not so much where the weed was at, because we were trying to time it so we would optimize forage production. So sometimes in terms of, I mean, if you were going to have a follow-up question, at times it was a pretty good time also to graze the thistle. You know, it was kind of at the bud stage, right at the, before flowering. At other times, it wasn't always a perfect match, but.
Right.
Does anyone else have any other questions? And there will be time for questions at the end as well. Okay. Thank you so much, Patrick. If anyone has questions they think of afterwards, please feel free to put them in the chat and we can put them to Patrick at the end. Our next presenter, I'm just going to pop a spotlight on right here, is Dr. Anne Weil. And if you would like to, let's get you unmuted, you are. And then if you'd like to, okay, perfect. And if you want to share your screen, that would be fantastic. And I'll introduce you. So Dr. Anne Weil is formerly of CTAB, which is the Centre of Expertise and Transfer in Organic and Local Agriculture in Quebec. She's currently a private consulting agronomist. She's going to talk on some trials that she did when she was with CTAB on managing Canada thistle, sow thistle, and coltsfoot, mostly in corn and soy production. So I will let Anne take it away.
You see my screen?
We can see your screen very clearly.
Good. Okay, hi everybody. I hope that my presentation will help you. In Quebec, the conditions are very different, and I think you'll be able to pick and choose what you can use in your systems. I did some research on weed, and especially the thistles and coltsfoot, because it had become the major barrier for cash crop production in Quebec. And basically, my research lasted about 6 years. And in the south of Quebec, where we use a lot of row crops, actually the technique we tried did work. And after 6 years, the farmers say, okay, let's do something else, like a problem basically solved. But at the same time, in more northern areas where there was no row crops, the problem still remains, and we still have to work on it. So I'll make a short introduction. We mostly, we only worked on farm, so they're only on-farm trial. And what was the most successful for us was the spring fallow. And we tested the control of sow thistle, Canada thistle, and coltsfoot. And we did quite a few experiments, and we were able to determine what were the key elements that would make a spring fallow successful. So the spring fallow basically is, we delay a bit seeding of the crop. And during the fallow, we work the soil 2 or 3 times to try to exhaust the thistles, and then we seed. And we don't lose any time, like we don't lose a year of production. And I will say a word on hay. And basically, my conclusion for hay is a bit the same as for Patrick. So all these years, the weed density were always increased. We had more and more milk thistle, more and more sow thistle, and at some point, coltsfoot appeared, and it seemed to be the toughest one to control. And you probably all know, if you have the problem, the weeds are hard to control because there are a lot of rhizomes. There is a deep root system as well, and for milk thistle, it produce a lot of seeds. So first we had some spots, and then it just enlarged to the whole field, and we had thistle just about everywhere. The coltsfoot doesn't make seeds, so these remained as spots unless people drag them with their tools to other part of the field. So you know the Canada thistle and the milk thistle, and we have the coltsfoot at the bottom. And the root system, it's interesting to look at it. I won't talk about that today, but the way you till the soil depends on the root system if you want to decrease the pressure. So on the left, we have the Canada thistle, which has a horizontal root system quite deep, while the milk thistle has a horizontal root system much shallower. So the deeper tillage will help a little bit decreasing the Canada thistle a bit, but it won't really work on the sow thistle. And then also for the coltsfoot, it's a little bit of everything. Like we cannot really have shallow or deep. It's the root system is everywhere. So what we had in Quebec were 2 traditional methods that were known to work. Is you exhaust the plant with the full summer fallow. So you work the soil every so often so that the thistle don't grow, or not very much. And the other system that was known to work was the hay in the rotation. We knew that about 3 years of alfalfa hay would work, okay? But the cash crop producer were not interested because it does cost a lot of money. Like the years you don't produce soybean or corn, you lose a lot of money. So how can we keep the cash coming and still control the thistle? So the spring fallow that we developed is we made 2 or 3 distractions in the spring when the reserve in the roots are minimal. And that's really important. Like the main key of the success is to destroy the plant when the reserves are minimal. And that is just before elongation of the stem. Like you have to do it when it's at, depending on the plant, 6 to maximum 8 leaf stage and before it starts to grow. And when you do your fallow, you use a harrow or a chisel with wide sweep that overlap. You have to make sure you cut all the stems. If you don't cut all the stems, and that happened with disc. Sometimes the disc float over the stems, it float over the rhizomes, and then it's not all cut and it doesn't work. So, oops. So what we did is we had 15 trials on 6 farms over 4 years, and I'm gonna only present 2 trials. So first trial, it was we had a field with a lot of Canada thistle and a lot of sow thistle. You can see, you see my pointer when I the Canada thistle, the average density was 72 plant per square meter, and
We can
Sorry?
see your pointer. Sorry to interrupt. We can see your pointer.
Okay, great, thanks. And for the sow thistle, the average density was 65 tiller per square meter. We had both in the same field. And when we did our research, we always choose spots with high density, and we actually always did the counting in these spots, so we knew where we were starting from, and we could see the evolution. So we did either 2 passes of wide sweep harrow or 3 passes. And I have the date for the passes, and this time we seeded some 6-inch row soybeans. And the result, so after 2 passes, can you see? Oops, sorry. What's going on? I apologize. Okay. So after 2 passes of the harrow, the next year we made our count, and for the sow thistle, problem solved. We had 0 plant per square meter. For the Canada thistle, it remained. We had 27 plant per square meter. So that was the next year. First year, the fallow and the soybean, and then we did our counting the year following in the corn. We wanted to see the more long-term effect. With 3 passes, we had 0 plant per square meter for the thistle and 3 plant for the Canada thistle. So it worked really well. And here is the counting, like on the left, you had the count before treatment, around 60 to 80 plant per square meter for the thistle, Canada thistle. And after 2 passes, we still had for the Canada thistle about 30. And with 3 passes, we had nearly 0. So we knew that we could do something, it should work. And so we kept doing some experiments. And we checked the timing and what was required to really have our system successful. So I'm going to present a second experiment, and I'll give you sort of some key element. So the second experiment that we did it against the coltsfoot, which it's all the same principle as the sow thistle and the Canada thistle. It's just a tougher weed. And again, we checked 2 passes versus 3 passes in the spring. And after that, we planted soybean, cultivated soybean, wide row soybean. And you can see like the 2 circles, the blue circle, we did 3 passes. And there was no regrowth after 3 passes, and 2 passes, we could see that there was a lot of regrowth. So again, 3 passes seem to work quite well. So after 2 passes, we still had 59 plants per square meter after the treatments. And after 3 passes, we had 0. Again, here are the counts. Like before the treatment, we had about 120 plants per square meter. And after the treatment, we were left with about 60 plants per square meter with 2 passes. That was in the fall. And with basically 0 plants after 3 passes in the fall. So excellent control with 3 distraction, 2 distraction. It wasn't really the matter of making 2 or 3 distraction, as we found out later. It was the timing. The interval between the 2 distraction was too long. So the the coltsfoot managed to reaccumulate reserves. And so our system didn't work. Like the trick is that the plant cannot accumulate reserve between the treatments. The overall result of our 15 on-farm trials with 26 treatments, we had success in 17 treatments out of 26. We had failure for 9 treatments out of 26. The failure was due to poor timing. We either destroyed the plant too early or too late. And there were 2 other elements that I haven't really talked about yet, is the lack of crop competition after the fallow. If you do the fallow, you put a crop, but if the crop is not competitive, if the crop is weak, it's just not going to work. You need a very competitive crop after. And cultivation help actually compensate for a crop which isn't that competitive. So you really need the 3 ingredients. You do 2 or 3 passes with a good timing, and you have something which is competitive after. So the failure, in terms of timing, the role of timing, the failure was observed when the first distraction was too late. So the dates are not too important for you. I won't go through it, but or when the interval between distraction was too short. If the interval is too short, when after the first distraction, the plant regrows, but it doesn't use its reserve enough. You destroy it again. So it's just the second distraction counts for nothing. So that's when it's too short. And when it's too long, well, the plant is able to remake reserves when you destroy it a second time. So the weed stage is very important. The role of an aggressive crop or competition, like here you can see this is with coltsfoot, it regrows. It regrows because the soybean was destroyed when cultivation was made. So no competition, it regrows. Like you can do your summer fallow, but it's good for nothing. Anywhere else where the crop wasn't destroyed, it never regrowed. And also the role of cultivation, that is really an interesting observation we made is, this is on the right, we have 30-inch soybean. And on the left, we have 5-inch soybean. So on the right, we have cultivation with wide sweeps, with different cultivator. And on the left, we have none. And you can see the effect of the treatment. It was amazing. So all the thistle is destroyed in between the rows, and the thistle on the row has a lot of competition, has a lot of its roots cut, and it does not grow as well, or very little even. Now, so basically, after we did all these trials, for people who had sort of a corn, soybean, wheat rotation, the problem was solved. They knew they could do their spring cultivation and sort of really decrease the pressure and go on. But now with the new cultivating tools that we have that are very precise, that allows farmers to cultivate an inch from the row or an inch and a half from the row with different tools. They use good timing. They use GPS and a camera to be really precise. They manage to really keep the control on the thistles without doing the spring fallow. So it basically has become a fairly small problem. I've put the link if you want to see all the tools that I use. Like the farmers have many tools. They try one, they check, and if the tool doesn't do exactly the right work, they go get another one. It's a lot of timing with agronomists that are specialized in the field that look only after the mechanical weeding. This is an example where they can go really close to the row crops, and so they really manage to control a lot of the thistle that way. A word about hay. And so as Patrick said, the hay can work if you get a good establishment of the alfalfa. And that is tricky because if you have already a lot of thistles at the beginning, you seed your hay and the thistle grows first, and then the alfalfa doesn't grow, and then the alfalfa doesn't do the job because it cannot establish. So you have to make sure to slow down the thistle one way or the other when you establish the hay. And it will work if it's very well established. And 2 years is not bad. And for us, with 3 years, we really get rid of the weeds. It's a problem that we have not solved in northern area. I'm sorry, I'm going to close the door because there is noise next door. Okay, it's a problem that remains up north in Quebec because they don't grow alfalfa, they grow clover. It doesn't work as well. They only do two cats per summer, and I think we need at least 3 cats. But I just have one table to show you about hay. That's sorry, I add something in French. 2 years of hay. We started with 131 plant per square meter with Canada thistle and 79 for milk thistle and 169 plant per square meter with coltsfoot. And after 2 years of hay, we have 0. And then I measure the year after. This is still at the end. Yeah, no, it's so June 2015 we had. 16 is 1 year and 17 second year. Yeah, it's in the spring, but it remains 0 through 2017. And then when we went into corn or soybean, it remains 0. So it worked really well, but only if you can establish well the alfalfa. And yeah, people who do red clover so far haven't seen any success. People who do 2 cats per year haven't seen any success. And we still have to figure out like what's going on there. So as a conclusion, like in southern Quebec, spring fallow can be very effective for controlling Canada thistle, sow thistle, and coltsfoot, but it's not necessarily true in colder regions. And a lot of the funding for all this research was from NSERC and the Ministry of Agriculture, MAPAC. And we had 6 farms that were partners to do the research. So that's it.
Thank you so much, Anne. That's hugely successful results. It sounds like 3 years is the sweet spot. But it also sounds like in the northern areas, there's still not a great solution. Is that correct?
No, yeah, we
Yeah.
still have to do a fair bit of work on that.
Is there any current sort of trials happening in the north?
Well, before I left that program, I was starting some programs, but I don't think it carried on.
Okay.
For me, what I think, they still produce some cash crop that needs a lot of nitrogen. And the one solution I see is that they do the spring fallow, and then they put a very aggressive cover crop. So it makes the nitrogen for the following year. They're not really losing the year, and that would work. But it's the one solution I see. The other solution, I was wondering if I think they can switch from red clover to alfalfa. I think the problem is a problem of drainage. Maybe it's not in a dry area. But if the drainage is not very good, and often in these areas which are more extensive agriculture, they're not very good at having a perfectly leveled field, a very well drained field. So alfalfa doesn't work very well. So they go for red clover, and this is where it doesn't work. So I think they could solve their problem.
Thank you. We have one question in the chat. I will read it out. Patrick Carr did answer one aspect of it, but I will read it to you. It's from Nicole, I think Gears. We're on southern Vancouver Island, so mild winters, quite wet in the fall, winter, and then dry in the summer. Alfalfa is not typically grown in that region, but we have issues with thistle, bindweed, but also creeping buttercup. So question number 1, what specifically about alfalfa worked to suppress thistle, and could this be achieved with another similar forage crop? So Patrick did answer that, and just to share that with everyone, it's because alfalfa is a perennial with a deep root system, making it very competitive to relatively shallower rooted annual crops. Also in Montana, organic environments tend to be lower in nitrogen, and alfalfa can fix that nitrogen biologically, giving it a competitive advantage in low nitrogen environments versus thistle and bindweed. So it gets a bit of ahead there. So I'm not sure if anyone has the answer to, the second part of that first question, which is there another similar forage other than alfalfa? But the second question is, would this management strategy also work against creeping buttercup or other creeping type weeds? I'm not sure if that is in anyone's, if anyone knows, but I'm just going to throw that out there to either Anne or Patrick or anyone else.
No, me, I don't know. I haven't worked on these weeds yet.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, thank you so much, Anne. And again, if anyone has more questions they think of later, we can just pop them in the chat and we can put them to Anne at the end. We now have Percy Fokard, who is a grazier of beef cattle. So he's going to talk a bit about his management techniques of thistle in that setting. He's also an instructor at the Thompson Rivers University for the Sustainable Ranching Program. Percy, I'm just going to get you spotlit up here. Okay, and oh, actually, sorry, Percy, before you start, someone does have a question for Patrick. I'm just going to ask that question before we move on. How many cuts of alfalfa, to Patrick, how many cuts of alfalfa in the alfalfa rotation? And Patrick, you'll need to unmute yourself.
Yep, I'm unmuted.
Perfect.
In Montana, under dryland management, we typically are getting 1 cut.
Okay.
So that's dryland, and yeah, that's what we got.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, Percy.
Good morning, everybody. Just to put a little bit of context into my presentation, I don't have a PowerPoint. It's less scientific, a little more the art of farming, I guess, observations and such. My farming context for my grazing is not a nice flat field. It's not arable land. I typically graze those marginal areas that are either too dry, too steep, poor soil types, too wet. I'm often not even grazing grass. I'm grazing weeds just because simply that's where the economics to beef cattle can lie, in the little niche that I have carved out for myself. I can rent poor land that no one else can do anything with. And with a herd of beef cattle that are well trained to electric fence, you can kind of put them anywhere and manage to quickly move them around and keep their plane of nutrition very high, so I can still finish a high quality beef off of grass and weeds for good flavor. And so hence why I don't typically graze flat uniform fields, other than maybe early in the spring and late in the fall, when I might be grazing some aftermath from an alfalfa hay crop or something along those lines. But just simply economics, and where you need to be very smooth and very slick with how you manage your your very low margin beef crop. I do graze a lot of weeds, and they have good forage value. So the fields that I graze, that I have a lot of thistles. I also have other things. I also have sow thistle, I have burdock, I have buttercup, and a few other little odds and ends. But I'll try to keep my I guess my talk focused on the thistle aspect. And there's sort of two sides. There's two sides to this. There's the animal side to this, and there's the plant side to this. So typically, when you have a grazing operation, you are going to be moving your animals around, and you might move them once a day or 2 or 3 times a day, depending on timing and life and everything else that's happening with your operation. So in June and July, when plant growth is the fastest, that's typically when you're going to be moving your animals around as much as you possibly can. So in June, when the plants are first typically starting to emerge, grasses do tend to jump up faster than forbs, faster than alfalfa, faster than thistles. And that's typically when I'll stop feeding hay and start to go on to my grazing program. So, of course, you're going to be covering a lot of ground, and the goal is to move them fast so that you can get around to that ground a second or a third time, if possible, as well as stockpiling your forage, so that then you're allowing your forage crop to thrive in the drought later in the summer, and then you have a stockpiled forage to move on to push off your hay feeding late into the winter as much as you possibly as you can. And the taller your stockpiled crop, if you're grazing perennial forages, the longer you can graze when the snow starts to fly. If you have a foot tall forage grass weed crop, you can get a lot of grazing even when you have still 6 inches of snow, because simply cattle will dig through and they'll get that if you have pulled the grazing off kind of mid to late August, so that you have that period for it to recover after a couple periods of grazing. And then you have also a good grass crop that's going to outcompete your weeds. So to focus on that side and the thistle side, the key to good thistle control is, one, training your herd. So you're going to be moving your animals around in the spring, and as they do that, they're going to be eating a bunch of different things. And if you give them a lot of area and the ability to selectively graze just the things that they like, for the rest of the growing season, that's kind of what they're going to be trained to do. They're not going to, if you gave them 20 acres and you put 100 cows out there, they're not going to graze the thistles until all the grass is gone, and they're getting 2 or 3 bites well down into the grass, and you're going to be significantly impacting your grass. So the idea with it, the more advanced grazing, where you have a high density herd and you're trying to get up somewhere around 100,000 pounds per acre to really get a good impact, and you're trying to limit that selective ability of a cow to not only go for what it wants, but to make it eat things it doesn't necessarily want. And so when I'm grazing areas, typically in June and July, and I'm getting into these areas where all of a sudden thistles are starting to grow, early in June, I will move them fast enough so that the grass is not impacted, so that the thistles, when they do get up, also still have a grass crop surrounding them that then the cattle can move into. But then starting to get into July, the thistles are going to elongate and they're going to get at that pre-bud stage. And providing that you have trained your cattle earlier in June to start to nip at thistles a little bit, this is when you can start to focus your grazing operation to intensively get on those thistle patches. So if I have an area of a field and it might only be a quarter or an eighth of a hectare or less, I have no problem putting up electric fence and moving 60 or 100 head into a tiny little area that is intensive thistle, so you can really start to knock it back. If you graze thistle earlier in June and you might take the tip off that plant, it's still going to put up a whole bunch of little buds, and you're going to get a low plant that then will put up maybe even more flowers, who knows. Whereas when you start to graze them and you're getting at that elongation stage pre-bud, and then you graze it, that's when the plant has put most of its reserves and carbohydrates into its flower stage, and that's when it's the most susceptible. And maybe this is why the other researchers are finding when you're in a hay crop and you're cutting in July that you're starting to knock back that thistle as well. So if I'm in July and I want to then start focusing on my fields that have weed problems, and burdock is the same way, this is when I will start to move animals into a very tight mob grazing setting, so I can really focus on getting those plants knocked back. And timing is key, and getting a good density is also key of those cattle in those mobs. And you always need to have water and salt in any spot that you're grazing, but there's not really anything wrong with putting cows in somewhere for, say, 2 hours to really target a thistle or a weed patch without water, providing that then the next spot they can go and get water again. So I'm trying to think a little bit about the animal husbandry, and they're thinking about their needs. But there's a lot of nutrition in those thistles, especially at that July time of year pre-bud. And I actually see a lot of good weight gain, even when I force cattle onto things they don't necessarily like, because that nutrition component is high. So if you are continuing to grazing into July, getting into August, and this is when thistles will start to head out and get seeded, and anything that you either missed or that you were not able to get at, or you grazed too early in the year and it made a whole bunch of little side shoots that then have all budded out, that's when it's the most challenging to graze most weeds. The nutrition content is starting to drop, the plants are getting tougher, and the cattle really want to just then go for that nice lush grass. So of course, if you haven't pushed your grass too hard and you've only allowed 1 or 2 bites on your grass crop as well as your thistle crop, and you're in July, you're going to see that grass crop really respond. You're going to see that apical bud taking off of that of your grass, and it can even be a weedy grass like reed canary grass or quack grass, or those grasses that typically are not well liked by the cropping and the hay producers. But if you get just the tips taken off, those plants are going to respond by putting more of their energy into growing more leaf area. So this is, the whole concept of regenerative grazing or advanced grazing is keeping your grass swards in a vegetative state for as much of the growing period as you can feasibly do, moving your cattle around and recognizing all the holistic things that happen in your life that impact when this happens. Kids get out of school in the end of June, and then all of a sudden it's more difficult to devote as much time to good grazing. So there's that holistic aspect to life and farming that you have to keep in mind. So if you can do as much quick grazing as you possibly can, and you can make sure that your swards are always kept in a vegetative state, your grass swards, and you can make sure that you can confine your animals enough during those times when they're in the weedy patches. Over time, I've seen pretty amazing suppression and dropping out of the thistles in the plant communities, where all of a sudden you'll get grasses that are really starting to recover. The soils seem to hold water a little bit better. The thistles are not as competitive. The density drops a little bit. I've never been in a situation where I've completely eliminated thistles, but that's not really my goal. My goal is to suppress it enough so that I can then get more grass swards. So then I can focus less on trying to get the cattle and the time consuming part of farming to get the cattle onto those thistles, and focus more on spending the time with my kids in the summer. So there's kind of the somewhat artistic, holistic side. It's not as scientific. But from a cattle perspective, there's a lot of forage value in thistles. And, I can still finish a 2-year-old steer on thistles and weeds in the summer and have people rave about the quality of the beef. So I'm basically creating food from something that someone might not have value for in another setting. And to make money in farming, that's how I have to do it. So there's my informal presentation, and that's all I have. And I can just open it up for questions.
Thanks so much, Percy. Does anyone have any questions for Percy? I noticed in our poll that we have 4%. Oh, let me have a look here. 4% of people are actually graziers. I thought there would be more coming. So, but it looks like we have a question from Scott Gillespie. Interesting observation about grazing early, making smaller and more numerous plants. With tillage, it doesn't matter as much if they are big or small to some extent. I guess the key takeaway for crop is if you want to mow, go a little later than tillage. Okay, so this is that's from Scott, not less, more of a statement than a question.
And I'll just mention that mowing, of course, is also going to be a benefit to suppressing those thistles. And I know a lot of grazers that if they can't get on their thistles fast enough, or they can't get a rotation around fast enough, they'll take their mower out and they'll mow those thistles. The problem is that if you have overgrazed your grass forage crop, and then you go to mow your thistles, you can be potentially shooting yourself in the foot. We sometimes don't think as a grazer, okay, so if we're going to take 3 or 4 bites off of our grass, yes, we're going to be suppressing our ability of the grass to respond, but we also could be potentially compacting our soils. Whereas when you only allow your cattle to take 1 or 2 bites, you're really allowing those grasses to invigorate themselves and hopefully reduce that compacted soil. So something to think about when it comes to mowing. Mowing is very helpful, but mowing an overgrazed stand is you might be working against yourself.
So there's a comment from Talawalola saying that this means that thistles cannot be completely eliminated, which I think when you and I were talking, Percy, you made the point that it's not necessarily the goal. You were just trying to manage the balance of the things that you want and the things that you don't want. Is that correct?
Yes, but I mean, I have to put my context into perspective. I am not a row cropper, so I don't need to get rid of everything. It has value. My goal is more to build soil by using grazing to regenerate my forage crop, to keep it vegetative, and so I can handle thistles. It's not a problem, but I want to reduce the thistles simply because it makes my management easier and it reduces my time constraints a little later on in the growing season because it's easier to graze grass than it is to graze weeds. It's more time consuming to graze weeds because you have to spend a little more intensive time with your cattle.
Okay, just more management.
And sheep are the same way. You know, and sheep probably do a better job of grazing weeds than cattle do. I just unfortunately don't have sheep with my cattle, but if there's a sheep farmer here that is implementing a similar system, I would, you know, that would be interesting to hear their perspective.
I'm not sure if we have a sheep farmer here at all. If we do, please speak up if you have any experience with this. But I also do have, there's a ranch in the Caribou in BC who has had success with grazing sheep and setting Canada thistle back. And I'll just read a little bit of what they've told me. So they have decreased they have a couple of different fields that had 30% Canada thistle at their own count, and they've knocked them right back to around 2% by grazing with sheep. So they do it sort of 2 years in a rotational grazing. So they'll graze the first year, they'll graze them again. It's really important to not allow them to go to seed. So if we miss the ultimate timing for grazing because of our rotation plan, we use a weed eater. We go in and do sort of manual removal. So they're a smaller scale farm to cut it down. But the livestock will actually eat it after about 10 minutes of cutting because it will wilt and make it more palatable to them. So, and then the horses are also eating them as well when that happens. So that's interesting. Yeah.
My neighbor, we had dinner the other night and she was telling me how her horses love to eat the thistles after they've been mowed. She whacks them, weed whacks them down, and then her horses go in and gobble them up. So,
right. So that sounds like their experience as well. So just they get a little bit more palatable for some reason, a little softer perhaps. Does anyone have any questions for Percy? Okay, thank you so much, Percy. We had a couple of questions come in for Anne while you were talking there, Percy. So I'm going to pop you on mute, but I'm going to put the questions to Anne. Anne, would you be able to unmute yourself? So there was oh, thank you. And I think you answered this in the chat, but if you can just speak it, there's actually 3 questions for you. So your planting date of late July for soybeans seems very late. I assume due to the necessity of doing 3 cultivations at least 2 weeks apart to destroy the thistle. I farm in Eastern Ontario in a 2,800 heat unit area. Would this be a comparable climate zone? And I have never planted beans later than June the 7th.
Yeah, no, didn't go for late July. It's at the latest mid-June for planting. And you can get away with only 2 passes if you have the right timing. Like most farmers don't manage to make 3 because that would delay too much. But 2 passes can work. And Eastern Ontario, it's about the same heat units as Southern Quebec, so it should work. And as I am answering, I saw a question which says that means that we cannot, thistle cannot be completely eliminated. I think they cannot be completely eliminated. Even if you manage to have no thistle, like the next year after you did your, which measure which is extreme, like the spring fallow and some row crop cultivated, they always come back after a couple of years or after 3 years. They're back. Like it's an ongoing management. The good thing for the row crops are the new cultivation tools and the new techniques that are so precise that we manage to keep them at bay.
Right. So they're always there, but they're able to manage. They're able to be managed as long as you're on top of it. Okay.
The seeds. I mean, now there is a bank of seeds. Which we didn't have before. At the beginning, we only had some. It was spotty, but now, like the Canada thistle and the soft thistle, they make seeds, and we have a bank.
Okay.
And I want to add something. Is we have this bank of seeds, and they germinate in the fall as well. And if they germinate early enough in the fall, you have thistle the next year, so some fall tillage might be necessary, not heavy tillage, but to destroy these seedlings, because they can be a huge problem the next year.
Right. Okay. The other question, another question for you. I have usually used a disc when fallowing to kill thistle and quackgrass because I am afraid a cultivator will drag the rhizomes around and spread the weeds. But you recommend with a wide sweep cultivator. I assume that anything, yeah.
Yeah, it's true that if you have only spots, like you don't have it in your whole field, with the teeth and the sweeps, you can drag some rhizome and spread it. I'm not worried with quackgrass. Quackgrass, you want to pull the rhizome and put them in at the surface. So it's better to use a tool with tooth and sweeps, or for quackgrass, just teeth. Doesn't matter whether the sweeps are wide or not. For the thistle, what I noticed, because I worked with a farmer that was doing everything like that he was supposed to do. He had some aggressive disc harrow, and it was surprisingly it wasn't working. And finally I checked, and the disc harrow was not doing the job because he had a lot of thistle. It was kind of floating above the thistle, but it was moving enough soil that you had the impression that it was working, because the soil would sort of go on top and cover the thistle, but the thistle was not destroyed. And he only managed to get rid of his thistle problem when he switched to an aggressive wide sweep chisel.
Okay.
So if you go with a disc with the thistles, go move the earth with your hand and check what's the job.
If it's done.
If it's done, yeah.
The second part to that question was, I assume that anything is spread does not get a chance to grow because of each subsequent cultivation.
Yeah.
Is that the case?
Sorry, can you repeat?
Oh, sorry. They assume that anything that is spread does not get a chance to grow because of each subsequent cultivation.
Yeah,
Destroys the rhizomes. Yeah. Okay. And then the last question. So do you wait until the Canada thistle is about 6 inches high before each tillage operation?
No, it has to be. Do you say in English the rosette? Rosette. It has to be a rosette. Like it has to be. All the leaves have to be sort of just flat on the ground. I think, if I remember well, it's for the south thistle, it must be 6 to 8 leaves, and the Canada, it might be a little bit less, like 5 to 7. Like it really has to be before the stem elongates. So when it's enough leaves, like you want more than 4 leaves, because if you go at 2, 3 leaves, it doesn't do the job. So you leave it as much as you can, but before you start to have a bit of a stem. And the other thing is with Canada thistle, it's a very hard stem. So if you wait a little too much, your wide sweep don't cut the stem. When you pass the wide sweep, if you look, it sort of moves the stem on the side, but it doesn't cut it. So the job is not done. It's not a problem with South thistle, which has a sort of a soft stem, but it is a problem with the Canada thistle.
Thank you. Someone says we use a vertical disc and have to go in after with wide sweeps to bring the thistle root up to the top of the soil. Excuse me. If we didn't do this, we didn't kill the thistle. So just offering some feedback there.
I'm not familiar with the vertical disc. You won't bring all the root of the thistle up the top. I mean, what's interesting with the Canada thistle is the horizontal rhizome are maybe 10-inch deep, and you don't till your soil 10-inch. So, but if you can cut the vertical roots above the horizontal rhizome low enough, it takes much more energy for the thistle to regrow, which is what you're trying to do. with the south thistle, because the horizontal rhizome are so high, you don't need to go deep at all. It doesn't make a difference.
Okay.
You want to destroy the foliage so it regrows and it uses its reserve, but you never get rid of the roots. You never bring everything up.
Okay. Thank you, Anne. Someone has said, thank you, Anne, for these specific details. Does anyone have any more questions for Anne or Percy or Dr. Patrick Carr, who actually does have to leave at 12:30? Sol, go ahead. You have a question.
Yeah, I'm kind of blown away by your results. And I farm on southern Vancouver Island and have very little space, so I haven't been able to put anything into fallow. But I've found that I'm pretty much completely overrun by thistle and having to give up a section of land because of that, and move on to an entirely new piece of land. So my question is around whether, with those three passes that you've done and the timing of that, you're getting it at the rosette stage in the beginning. Have you done any deeper study, like digging down and looking at the lateral roots and seeing how much growth or how much energy it's put on over the winter and into the spring? Because here on the West Coast, we've got very wet soil. So by the time you're able to even get on the land, the stems have already elongated, and I'm not sure how we would even be able to get in before the stems have elongated. Yeah, I'm just curious what, because in my experience, the more I destroy the plant, the more growth I get, and multiple destructions will still, I'll get even more growth by the end of the season. So
yeah. I haven't done the research myself, but there is a lot of research, a lot of literature about the reserves in the roots, and I based my work on that. Like I saw like the research which said, the reserves are minimal before stem elongation. So that seems pretty well established. When you do the first distraction, every little bit that you cut will regrow. So it seems that you have more. You multiply it really. If you do, let's say, just one distraction, you will multiply it. The key is to the timing and the number of distraction, so you exhaust it. But yeah, just one or two with the wrong timing, and you end up with more. So you really have to finish the job properly. It depends how big your land is too. Like if you're on a small scale, you might be able to put some black plastic and sort of choke it like this. But if you're a small scale farmer, large scale, yeah, you need to have the drain. The thing is, if your field doesn't dry fast enough in the spring, which means that your drainage is not optimal, you always run into problems, and that's really difficult to resolve.
Yeah, I guess I'm just thinking, because the timing here, you've got stem elongation happening, I would say probably in March. So you're quite wet, right? And even now I'm seeing new growth coming on, and it's January. So I'm wondering, I guess, like with the three destructive passes, if your first pass is too late, can you make up for it? I guess would be the question. But could you make up for that with 3 or even 4 passes?
Well, I haven't checked. I cannot say, but there may be a few directions you can check. Like you could try to do some deep tillage in the fall. It's not great. You lose soil with erosion. It's not what's recommended. Really till your soil, but If you do some
Mhm.
deep tillage in the fall, then it's slower for the thistle to grow later on in the season, and it takes a lot more energy to grow.
Mm.
I wouldn't try it full scale. I'll try, one strip to see what's going on with that. I think also if you catch it later on, maybe by trying to keep after doing some destruction, it may work. I think a big component is this in the system is after your destruction is the competition. So because you can destroy as much, if you destroy during the whole summer, which is a lot of tillage, usually works. But if you don't want to do that, just to put a very aggressive green manure at some point, which will really help for your next crop, it would be the solution.
Yeah, this is something I'm experimenting with, is putting in a cover crop earlier in the fall and doing the tillage at that point, getting the cover crop in strong and then allowing it to go further into the spring to try and hold it until after we're able to get into the fields.
Because the question is, okay, like for us in Quebec, like the first thing that grows are the thistle. They're faster than anything else.
Yeah.
But in BC with milder winter, do you have something which would grow faster, or at least as fast as the thistle, to keep them at bay until you can do something else? Like, well, that's the idea of alfalfa in your rotation, but then you lose your field for 3 years, which is not great. But there might be something that could regrow very vigorously late, like early spring, and make competition with the thistle.
Mhm.
And then after that, depending on the situation, you destroy everything and you do your 2 or 3 passes and you replant something. Like it seems like you need some on-farm research to figure it out.
I know, I've been wanting that. Thank you.
There is a comment in the comments. Someone is saying that I farm about 100 acres of winter wheat and soybeans. Yeah. Some fields or parts of the fields don't have much thistle. So when a small patch appears, I get off the tractor and I flag it. I come back later and cover the patch with black plastic, and this eliminates the patch in a couple of months. So black plastic mulch, as what you're saying, Anne, is actually helpful even in a larger scale setting if you've just got patches here and there.
Yeah, at the beginning we were trying to work only in the patches, like our first trials with fallows. We would just destroy the patch, and we also tried the plastic. The trick is to make it big enough so that, because a stem, a horizontal rhizome of a thistle, it can grow 1 meter, 2 meter. So you need your plastic big enough. But then, yeah, that's a good idea.
Mm-hmm. And then Scott Gillespie, I was just going to ask about this. Maybe fall rye could live all winter, like you were saying.
Yeah, I would try fall rye. Yeah,
the packages.
yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Okay, excellent. Does anyone have any more questions for any of the presenters? We've got one more presenter. Okay, we will move on. Thank you so much again, Anne. We're going to move on to Alden Brawl. Let me just pop him up. So Alden is a farmer in Armstrong. Is that correct? Armstrong, in the North Okanagan? Yep. Yes. Okay. And he's an agrologist, but he is also a farmer of alfalfa, wheat, and wheat seed, but also alfalfa hay, I believe. And there is significant amounts of bindweed in his area, and he has not completely got rid of it, but has management strategies that he's going to share with us now. So take it away, Alden.
Okay, you can hear me?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you for this opportunity to share a little bit about our experience working with field bindweed. I farm with my brother in the Armstrong area, and we're growing organic alfalfa seed. I assume not a lot of you are aware of how this crop is grown, so I will just take a couple minutes to quickly describe this farming operation. Unlike alfalfa hay, we don't grow the alfalfa for hay or forage. We grow it for seed production. And that means you're combining it rather than baling it off and feeding your cattle with it. We use a much lower planting density. We plant in 20-inch to 36-inch rows at about 3/4, maybe up to 1.5 pounds per acre. And as has been indicated, establishment phase is the most difficult, especially when you have weed problems, which are common in organic operations. But once you get it established, there are numerous tillage weed control options that are out there before canopy closure. We've talked a little bit about the row tillage. And these operations are very effective on some of the small summer annuals as well as some of the winter annuals. There is limited control at times on perennial weeds like field bindweed, Canada thistle, and especially cooch, as they call it here, quackgrass. So what happens here is we'll let the alfalfa grow, and once it's in the flowering stage, we bring out our leafcutter bees for pollination, which happens over about a 5-week period. And then we let the seed develop, mature, and swath it and then combine it. So that's just a very brief overview of what we're doing. I'll tell you a little bit of a story of our experience working with field bindweed here in the Armstrong area. We rented a piece of land in 2021. It had been seeded into fall rye the fall before, so in the fall of 2020. And we decided, based on some experience in Ontario, that we would plant our alfalfa directly into this fall rye. We did that beginning of April. It was a very early year. We had good germination on about 90% of the field, but unfortunately, we soon saw that we had a lot of weed issues in the field, one of which was field bindweed. About 30% of the field had it, and it was basically taking over our alfalfa. We didn't have a chance, and that's been discussed already about the concern of having less competition, especially for alfalfa establishment. And so we were in a difficult situation. It was a very dry year, and we knew that we weren't going to get a good stand. Even the fall rye wasn't growing very well. Fortunately, we contacted Zach Miller from MSU, who worked with Patrick Carr, and got some good ideas on how we could control, or at least limit the growth, suppress the bindweed in our farming operation. And so what we did was what we don't like to do, and that is relying on heavy or intensive tillage the first summer. That was in 2021. We really didn't have an option because we couldn't replant anything there that was competitive because the rains were over. It really turned dry. We disked the field a couple times, June 9th and June 25th. Again, this did not work well for the reasons already discussed. And so mid-July, we were able to find a cultivator with sweeps. We knew that it was somewhat worn. The sweeps weren't as wide as they should be. And so here's what it was looking like before we came in with the cultivator. And then about a week after cultivation, the spaces between the sweeps, so we didn't have sufficient overlap, resulted in the growth of the fall rye there. Or sorry, not the bindweed. So those strips resulted from the worn out shovels. So then we used another option. We were able to purchase a Noble Blade from Alberta. Those of you who are familiar with this, or some of you might not be familiar, a Noble Blade is tillage equipment that was actually designed during the dirty 30s. It has very wide sweeps. They're usually about 6 feet wide and have close to 6 inches of overlap. And we went on our fields after the bindweed had come up again, usually every 2 to 3 weeks, to cut off the bindweed about 3 to 4 inches below the surface of the soil. And so this is what the field looked like. This was a very This is a very severely infested area of bindweed. You can see the gray area here, which is the field bindweed that's left on the surface after the pass with the noble blade. And so our goal here was to hopefully deplete the root reserves so that now here in fall and the next year, our alfalfa would have a better start. So what we did was in September, we seeded fall rye and we blocked off runs for the alfalfa. So here's where the alfalfa would be. And then we had the fall rye growing there. The next spring in 2022, unfortunately, our alfalfa seedlings that established in fall or winter killed. There was bindweed seedlings, but not the mature plants from the rhizomes growing yet. But we were in a situation where we had to reseed. So we went over it with heavy harrow twice, which basically knocked out all the annual weeds and some of the winter annuals, the summer and the winter annuals. And then we reseeded again between the fall rye rows. Now, this was fortunately effective in getting the alfalfa established. We had a little more rain in spring. And here you can see the alfalfa between the fall rye rows. This would have been a missed run or a run that was blocked off where there's no fall rye. Beginning of May, we could see once again that field bindweed was coming up. But interestingly, the alfalfa in these rows was always able to maintain maybe 2 or 3 inches of growth above the field bindweed. And that was just all we needed to get our alfalfa established. And then later in July, we had powdery mildew that defoliated all the bindweed plants, which was, I think, helpful in maybe reducing the plant, not sure how much it reduced root reserves. And then in fall, this is what our field looked like. All the bindweed had basically been defoliated between the alfalfa rows. Alfalfa, it hadn't rained for at least 2.5 months. So there was a lot of boron deficiencies on this alfalfa field. But we were hoping that for next year, at least, the field would be in better shape and we would have suppressed the bindweed. So this is what it looked like this past year in 2023. Earlier in spring, we used a heavy harrow just to clean up some of our winter annuals and summer annual weeds. And then we did 2 passes with a row crop cultivator using knives that were spaced about 2 inches from the alfalfa row. And we did a little bit of hilling. We did 2 passes with this. And that definitely, again, controlled the bindweed and the Canada thistle where it was. And this is a picture in July. This had been a heavily infected area of bindweed. And the amount of bindweed that was there, it was still there, but most of it stayed low. The odd plant actually wrapped up onto the alfalfa, but it wasn't a significant weed problem for us. Probably what was more of a weed problem was prickly lettuce in terms of affecting our yield. But we are fairly satisfied with how it went in terms of control. In summary then, I think some of the key aspects that we learned is number one, if you can avoid a field with bindweed, by all means, using competitive crops like alfalfa and for us fall rye were really important. And one interesting thing with the fall rye is between where the bindweed grew was not between the rows of fall rye. It was where there was a little wider spot where the alfalfa was. It was definitely feeling the effects of the fall rye, and it was just looking for a place where there was more sunlight. Inter-row cultivation, I think, was also very effective. Not sure how much impact the powdery mildew has had, but we've had powdery mildew for 2 years in a row. And looking forward to next year, we're not quite sure what will happen. Hoping that our bindweed will still be suppressed. But I guess we'll have a better idea after we see the regrowth in spring. That's my presentation, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Alden. That is really interesting to see. I had a question about, so you're using the fall rye as well, and that's been quite successful. That's good to see. There's a question in the chat. Why does the harrowing not kill the alfalfa when you are killing the winter annuals?
The alfalfa was established and it has a bigger root system, and we're not worried if we knock out a bit of alfalfa. The heavy harrowing really doesn't touch the alfalfa. We also used an implement called the Triple K, which has about 2-inch wide shovels on it, and the odd alfalfa plant would be knocked out. As you can see, we are not too concerned with a lower density on the alfalfa for our seed production, so it's really not an issue at all.
Okay. Does anyone else have any questions for Alden, or anyone else for that matter? Okay. So at this stage, I was going to break everyone out into groups depending on the crop that they were growing or the livestock that they were tending to. But it looks like in the polls that we have the majority are mixed vegetable farmers. So we have around we have about 48% of people who are here are mixed vegetable farmers. And interestingly enough, no one was necessarily speaking directly to mixed vegetable control. I mean, obviously some of these controls can, or management techniques can cross over to the different styles of growing. But I thought, instead of going to breakout groups, because it would be very unevenly weighted, I thought I would just encourage those of you well, anyone, feel free to, if you have any control techniques or management techniques that you found in any setting were helpful, to please bring them forward, because I feel like a lot of these sessions, we learn so much from actual producers who are doing things on the ground as well. So we've had these 2 producers already speak to us, but if anyone else has anything to add, that would be great. On top of that, I would just encourage mixed vegetable farmers, if anyone wants to come forward and just tell us any successes or challenges or any questions they have. So someone's asking, has anyone had success with the insects you can, that will actually eat thistles? There's some flies, I think. I have actually also heard of trials with different biological controls with thistles, and I don't personally know that much about them, so I can't speak to them. But does anybody else know about them? If anyone does, they can come back to the chat and let us know. But so that was, Leighton has brought up a very good point. It sounds like long-term silage tarping can really help, and that's something that I've also heard from other people as well, is that perhaps in a mixed vegetable setting particularly, and as we had that other person who was on a larger acre farm with sort of doing spot control of thistle by tarping, it sounds like that's a really good way to control thistle. And Leighton, I have a question for you. It's a long-term silage tarping. Can you clarify long-term?
Yeah, a few of the market farmers that I follow, especially in Quebec and France, they'll do like a 50 by 50 block, let's say, of a really exceptionally bad area, and leave the tarp all summer. Put it in early spring when the snow's melted, leave it all summer. In the fall, some of them do a fall rye or winter rye seeding. And the following year, let the rye go almost to seed, right before the seed has set and is viable. And they'll mow it or flail, chop and drop, whatever. And then silage tarp it again for another 2 weeks to kill the root mass there. And essentially what some of these farmers are getting is a stale seed bed with a good cover crop root mass rotting in the soil, so lots of carbon in there, and also a mulch on top. So one guy that's doing this exceptionally well is Daniel Mays, I believe, from Frith Farm in Maine. He has books out, he has lots of YouTube videos. Yeah, okay. Frith Farm, F-R-I-T-H.
Okay.
He's kind of the golden standard for that technique.
Okay, that's good to know. I'm going to put that in the chat. And he's in Maine.
Okay.
Excuse me.
And he has many excellent books.
Awesome. That's great, because that's obviously contributing a lot of great organic matter as well to the soil. Anne, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, it's a technique we use a lot on vegetable farms in Quebec, and it works very well. When you want to control annuals, you leave it part of the summer, but for perennial, you leave it a full season, and it really does the job. It's used a lot in France. Also.
Is that something that there's been trials involved? Like there's been trials around that, or that's just something that you've seen on farms in Quebec?
Yeah, it's on farms. Like we actually picked up the technique in France. Like they've been doing it. Like one farm is Joseph Templier that was doing it quite large scale. Like it was a fairly big mechanized farm, and they still use it. And it's so popular now in Quebec. Like we know it works.
Yeah, I feel like the silage shops are used very heavily sort of across the country now, which is great, and probably elsewhere as well. I personally didn't know specifically that it was helpful for those particular weeds, so that's good to hear.
And if the farm is too large to use that technique, I think it's really important to be able to have 1 year of green manure or at least at the most every 4 years, every 3 or 4 years. And this is the time where you can also control your perennial weeds. I think it's a key in the system, I think.
I personally find, as a mixed vegetable farmer, that I've often found cover cropping certain cover crops, and I have used winter rye, have actually been a bit of a license to grow weeds. But I wonder if it's just I need to increase. Is it important to just have your seeding density pretty high?
I think, but I'm mostly working on green manures now. I've abandoned the thistles, and yeah, it's really important to use a mix to know your objective. To use a mix with different strata. Like if you plant just one kind of plant, there might still be light at the bottom, and so the weeds can keep growing.
Okay.
And then the mix you have to choose depending whether you want to improve your soil or have a lot of nitrogen. But use 3 or 4 different kind of plants. That will really help. And if you have a weed problem, like a serious weed problem, you use a mix that you can mow in the summer. If you can do 1 or 2 cats. If you use a mix for the whole summer that you leave grow, you let grow the whole summer, it's great because it's not a lot of work. And like we have a mix which is rye and vetch seeded in the spring, hairy vetch, rye hairy vetch. It's fantastic. It makes a huge biomass. No weeds grow. But if your system, if your weed pressure is extremely high, it may not work. Then you use a mix with some plants that grow really fast, as a sort of, we say plante abri in Quebec. I forgot how to say in English, like something that grows fast, but you end the seed it with things that grow slower, a bit like when you establish a hayfield with a cereal. And at some point, you can mow, and then the stuff that has established a little bit slower keeps growing, and this way you can get rid of your weeds.
Okay.
So you really have 2 systems, like a lot of weeds, then it's the cover crop you must mow once in a while, or not so many weeds, and then you have, like in Quebec, it's the rye and hairy vetch is so aggressive.
Good to know. So mixes. I guess you've got the hairy vetch in the lower sort of canopy, and then the rye is growing higher. Which makes
well, actually, in our area, like the rye really helped to control the weeds, the little seedling, the annuals mostly, and the vetch starts to establish, and the vetch grows faster than the rye. The rye, which is so aggressive, is overgrown by the vetch, and at the end of the season, you see no rye and only vetch.
Okay, interesting. Well, thanks, Anne. Someone earlier in the chat had mentioned Andy Wegman. He missed the point of powdery mildew. Is this a good or a bad thing? And Alden Brawl had answered that powdery mildew is a good thing as it defoliates the bindweed and then it stops the ability of the plant to build root reserves. Does anyone else have any success stories or management techniques or questions for anybody at all? Anything that they want to share with the group? If so, raise your hand and unmute yourself and you can just speak. Okay. Particularly mixed vegetable farmers, but you know. I think that draws our session to a close. I just wanted to thank very much our 4 presenters for coming in and sharing their work and their experience in the field. Oh, I have another comment here, hang on. Okay, someone's just saying thank you. Yeah, fantastic. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining as well. This has been really great. I will send out a recording to everyone as well of this session so that you can catch it in more detail. I'm also going to put a link in the chat. This is a quick survey. If you have time, it'll take 2 minutes to do. I'd totally encourage you to jump into that survey and just let us know. It's for our funding for that helped host this webinar. And then, yeah, please feel free to get in contact if you have any ideas or thoughts in the future about different webinars that you'd like to see us hosting as well. Mike is asking, will any of the slideshows be available? I will talk with the presenters and find out. I do know that Patrick Carr cannot share his slides just yet because they are just in the process of compiling some reports before they release it. So yeah, I'll let you know and get in touch with the other presenters and let you know if we can share the other ones. Thank you, everybody. Take care. See you later.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Alden. Thank you, Anne. Patrick is gone. Thank you, Percy.
Yeah, thank you.